Can you tell us a little bit about your first trip to New York back in 1986 and how it affected you and in the course of your life?
So I left art school in the summer of 1986, and I had got back with there we go. That's a nice story for Valentine's Day. I'd got back together with my school girlfriend. So I met my now wife when we were 12 years old. And then she went to university and I went to art school. And we decided that it's crazy to have this sort of long-term, long-distance relationship. So we split up. But towards the end of the fourth year, we got back together again. So we got back together again for the summer, and we decided to go on holiday. So we went to New York, had an amazing time. We stayed with friends of Claire's just outside New York, and got the bus into Port Authority every day. And I set up 3 meetings while we were there, one with Marvel Comics, and one with DC Comics, and one with Continuity, which is Neil Adams' company. Do you know Continuity?
Yes.
Do you know Neil Adams?
Yep.
So I went to see. I think the first one was Continuity. I went to see them, and I had had a quick meeting with Neil Adams' daughter, who liked my portfolio, liked my work, and said, "Can you come back at the end of the week?" Yep. So I went to Marvel, and I had a quick meeting in the reception, and they were positive but couldn't see how I could do anything for Marvel. I went to DC at the end of the day and there was nobody there, and the receptionist just said, go on through and have a look around. So probably completely irresponsibly. So then I found a guy called Andy Helfer, who was an editor there, and had a chat with him. He was very nice, very encouraging, but that didn't come of anything. There was an artist there called Marshall Rogers. He was very nice and very encouraging. But I left DC without anything really. And so I went back at the end of the week to Continuity at the end of the day on Friday, and the doors opened and they were all there and they'd forgotten me. They'd forgotten about my appointment. And Neil Adams' daughter said, "Oh yeah, of course, come through. And then I found myself in an office with Neil Adams, who was very, very tough and very critical. And he looked through my stuff and he asked me lots of very pointed questions. But then at the end of it, he said, "Look, we're doing a comic called Crazy Man. I think you could do that. We'll send you the scripts." So I came back to England thinking, fantastic, I've got a job. It's my first job. And of course, nothing appeared. I called Continuity a few times, said, "Are you going to send me that script?" So, maybe, we'll see. Nothing ever happened. But I got a little bit of positive reaction from DC and Marvel, and that little positive thing from Continuity that kept me going into the next phase of doing stuff over here in England.
How did you meet Neil Gaiman? And in those early times, have you ever imagined you would have such a long-lasting collaboration?
Well, first of all, we met working on a magazine that in the end never happened. It was called Borderline. I had done some comics. I did 4 comics in art school called Meanwhile. And we used to sell them in London, and they were seen by a few different people. One of them was an editor called Lee Bulsh, and he was working on Borderline with the publisher. So he got me in based on Meanwhile. And I was writing and drawing 2 stories, one called The Fox and one called Going to California. And then every month we would have a meeting, an editorial meeting with all the people involved. And there were lots of people there, some of whom, like Mark Buckingham and Disraeli, who went on to be professional comics illustrators. And Neil was one of the other people there. So he was writing, I think, 3 stories. And it only lasted a brief while, but it was nice going up to London every month and sort of swapping pages and seeing what everybody was doing and feeling like you were part of a movement and a new energy making British comics. And Neil was very, he'd been working as a journalist, so he was very good at being very proactive and hustling work. So he gave me a script that he'd written in a writer's group called Violent Cases, which I thought, I liked it because it was just a general fiction story. It wasn't a genre story. It wasn't a fantasy story. It wasn't a superhero story, anything like that. It was just a general fiction story. So I thought it would make I could turn it into a comic. I've been talking to a guy called Paul Gravett, who was publishing Escape magazine, and he wanted me to do something. So I thought maybe we could do it for Paul. And so I just did that. And Borderline collapsed, never happened. But by then I was illustrating Violent Cases in my own time. And then when it was done, Paul had sold Escape to Titan Books, and Titan were our publisher. So then it was published, and that was that. It was good. It was good to have somebody to bounce ideas off and challenge and sort of grow up with, really, and go through all those initial hurdles of starting a professional life with somebody. That was good. But actually, we haven't had that long a collaborative life. I mean, the last thing we did together was 17 years ago. So it was just a brief period of time, really. It was some really good books, I think, Mr. Punch and Signal to Noise, and Wolves in the Walls. Some really terrible books like Black Orchid and a couple of other things. A film which is my least favourite film of all the films that I've done, called Mirror Mask. Some good children's books. So it's a mixed bag of things, really. And then Sandman. But Sandman was really a job, really, an illustration job. I never did the interiors. It's not my world. It was a cover gig every month.
It's completely impossible for a fan to dissociate your work from Sandman. Your covers are a huge part of the atmosphere. This Sandman would never be the Sandman without the stories that you told with your covers.
Well, thanks. That's nice to hear, and that's obviously what we were hoping for. The covers, certainly initially, when the Sandman was unknown and Neil was unknown, I hoped the covers worked as a way of reaching out to an audience who maybe were not buying comics, but could understand the aesthetic of the images on the cover and the typography as closer to the record albums they were buying, or the novels they were buying, or film posters that they were going to go and see. And so they would give it a chance because they recognized aesthetically it was part of their world. So I think that did do the job, because it did find that audience. But then once Sandman was established, it was much more to do with the writing and what Neil was writing. And now it's headed off, and it's gonna have its own life. There's going to be I think it's going to be a television series. So it's going to end up being a huge chaotic thing that has nothing to do with me at all, and probably nothing to do with Neil either. Certainly nothing to do with me.
As a matter of fact, I was going to ask you if you were involved in any way, or contacted to be involved.
It's really got nothing to do with me. I haven't been involved in any of that stuff for years. So, I'm done with that, Rich.
I'm curious to know about your creative process in conceptual terms, but also the way that you incorporated technology and a very straightforward collage technique of found objects, photography, etc.
Well, there's a couple of things there. There's what I was trying to do with them, which was I knew that the interior artwork was going to keep changing because the team drawing it could never keep up with the schedule. So it was always going to chop and change visually inside. So I wanted the covers to at least establish a kind of lens, really. You see the stories through the lens of the cover. So I wanted them to have an aesthetic which was not just a comic book aesthetic that reached out into the world. We talked a bit about that already. But I also wanted them to have a kind of a surreal, dreamlike quality of their own. They don't really tell the story, they sort of comment on it. And I don't like comic book covers that just take a scene from inside and put that on the front. It just seems to be redundant. I prefer covers that try and capture something of the idea of the story, or the theme of the story, or the atmosphere of the story. So it's more that sort of thing, really. And then all kinds of other decisions were made across the run of the book, because it went on for 7 or 8 years. There was a moment where I noticed on the stands, there was just a lot of big heads. A lot of comic artists were doing just big faces all the time to try and stand out. So there was a series called Brief Lives, and I decided just to make them all of tiny little objects, little arrangements of objects. So they're really, really undemonstrative, very small, subtle, little things. And because every other comic had a big head or a big explosion on it, they stood out again because they were just not what was around at the time. So those sorts of decisions were going on. And then technologically, I wanted each, I think after the first handful of issues, I thought it would be interesting if each story had its own visual look. So some of them were more photographic, some of them were more collage-based, some of them had big masks as the theme, some of them had, I've discovered the pleasures of torturing colour copy machines. So a series called A Game of You was photocopy experiments. And then about 2/3 of the way through the run, I'd been doing a lot of other things. I was doing a lot of album covers and stuff like that, and really enjoying that. I was getting a bit run out of steam, really. My battery's running out of doing the Sandman covers. So I did a few, I think it was World's End, that were not very good at all. But then I bought a computer, and that really charged my batteries again. So then the rest of the run there, going into Kindly Ones, I think it was, I really enjoyed that because I was playing around with the computer and finding new things to do. So looking back on it, it's strange. It functions like a diary because it's a monthly gig. It was whatever I was doing or thinking that month, and I can look back on those things. And I look at them. I remember exactly where I was and what I was thinking doing them. I remember the music I was listening to. I remember my relationship with Neil and his scripts at the time. Sometimes he was ahead and sometimes he was behind, and sometimes he was well behind. So I would only get bits of information to go on. So it all comes back. So these covers function very much like diary entries for the month, really.
I think of them on a musical level that suggests an atmosphere and a world and a place where you can dwell. For me as an adolescent, watching your covers was a lot like the experience of music, of being invited to a place.
Well, that's great. I mean, there were major influences like Vaughan Oliver's covers for the 4AD record label, and Gary Day Ellison's book covers for the Picador label. What I loved about those things is you end up trusting them. So I would buy Picador books and 4AD albums and ECM albums because I loved the covers, and I felt the aesthetic of this cover that I loved would reflect the music, and there's a very good chance that I would like the music as well. And so that's really what I wanted to key into with these covers. I wanted people to trust that they would like the stories, even though the visual language inside might go up and down and around. The nature of the stories, I think they would still like. So we were trying to build that trust with an audience. And that fed through also to the design of the books. I played around a lot with the typography in the books, sometimes making it quite difficult to read things, and it was kind of a game playing with my audience, really respecting their intelligence. I just knew that they would enjoy it and enjoy the game, and they would appreciate not being talked down to. I think at the time we felt that we knew that audience. We were that audience, and we knew that audience, and we felt able to talk to them in a way that maybe, other editors and whatever within DC couldn't, because they just didn't get that audience.
In 1993, you were one of the invited artists to the 7th Porto Comics convention. How do you remember this experience?
I loved it. I mean, it was, and it still is really. It's wonderful being invited to places and being chaperoned to a degree and shown around the city, and also be allowed to explore the city and then meet the people who are there. Get a sense of the comics that are going on there. That's wonderful as well, because a lot of that stuff doesn't travel. So I'm not going to find it in England. I have to go to these cities and countries to find that work. It's nice to meet my fellow artists and writers, especially when they turn out to be nice, interesting people like Joe Sacco. And I remembered it being really great. I remember we went to the port wine distilleries. That was amazing. I remember going through the city in a open top bus. It was a great trip. A lot of those trips around that time were my first visits to countries. So that would have been the first time I'd visited Portugal. So wonderful.
I first saw your work on the convention, but I was really young. I was intrigued by it. 2 years later, one of the organizers of the convention at a small comic book shop on his design studio, and I was asking him for advices. I was like 15 years old, and he said, "You really have to read this." And it was Cages. And Cages had a huge impact. The ideas of creation, the spaces, the pacing, the breathing, the idea of the exploration of human connection on those spaces. Can you tell us a little bit about these experiences? I believe that it must have been a learning process for you.
Yeah. Well, again, there's a whole bunch of things there. I think I've gone somewhere in explaining my feelings about sort of where comics were and the sort of mainstream of comics, and it's frustration with it just not growing up. I have to say now the situation is completely different. I think we're going through a golden age at the moment. There's all manner of extraordinary voices coming through comics medium that are not bogged down with sort of Marvel and DC stuff of the past. They're just looking at the medium as a very powerful tool and telling those stories. So it's very different now. But at the time, you know, I wanted to get on. I was hoping there would be more than just Mouse and When the Wind Blows on the stands. You know, if a medium is going to grow, there need to be many more books there for it to occupy a place in a bookstore. So I wanted to do a book that was about all the things that I was interested in. I was interested in real people, not fantasy people. I was interested in the way that they spoke, the way real people, their modes of speech, the rhythms of speech, their body language, They're actual facial expressions, not cartoon expressions. I was interested in things that I would, as an adult, that I was interested in. Trying to find my place in the world, trying to work out what I believed in, if anything. Trying to work out, I'm a creative person, so my belief system is creativity, really. So what does that mean? I loved jazz and the improvisation of jazz. I wanted to try and reflect that in a book, see how that would be. What are the big things that happen in your life? Falling in love is one of them. I wanted to explore that. And sex, I wanted to see sex in a book because, there's plenty of violence, and how many times daily do you enter a violent situation? Hopefully not many at all. And yet sex is never sex is just left out of the picture. But hopefully that plays a good part in most of our lives. So I wanted to redress that balance a bit. I'm really interested in stories and the fact that they communicate our sense of ourselves and our culture. So I wanted the book to be a story about stories, about storytelling. All manner of things, really. I wanted to create an environment that I really, that had a lovely atmosphere to it. I was completely besotted with the films of the Quay brothers and the dense atmospheres that they create, hermetic worlds that they create. And I wanted to try and do something like that. I loved the literature that they liked, Franz Kafka and Bruno Ganz, that sort of Middle European, slightly surreal but political surreal storytelling. I wanted to have a bit of that in there. I tried writing a bunch of short stories, but they all seemed to have the same sort of people in them and be set in the same place. So it just became this long book. And it was almost just like a train of thought, really, in the end.
It was extremely inspiring, and it's still one of my favorite books.
Great, thank you very much. It's still one of mine. It's still my baby.
I can't help to find a bit of irony that a work so distant of mainstream comics as Cages was first published by Kevin Eastman's Tumblr. An extremely courageous and interesting project of creating your own works that was funded with Ninja Turtles money.
Yeah.
Like in cinema, there always seems to be a permanent tension between the commercial and the artistic side of things, and I found it interesting this idea of the experience with Tundra coming from Ninja Turtles.
Yeah, I know. It was an extraordinary opportunity, is what it was. It was, just an amazing golden moment of opportunity where you had somebody who sort of by dumb luck really fell into this extraordinary position where they were able to be the Medici, and help and promote and publish work by people that they admired. And it was quite scattershot. If you look at what they published, it's kind of all over the place. There's no real single intelligence there. But I guess that's not what it was. It was an umbrella. And if you were an individual and you had something that you wanted to do, you could go to the board or Kevin and say, look, this is what I want to do. And it would just be part of the umbrella. So it really was a strange mixture of books that came out. And some of them were great and would never have found a publisher or an opportunity otherwise. And some of them were pretty dreadful. But that doesn't matter. It was an umbrella and a great opportunity. Unfortunately, it was not. It didn't have any kind of planning involved. It wasn't sustainable in any way. So anybody can spend lots of money to make things, but the tap just gets turned on, and unless you make it sustainable in some way, It's just a short-term hit. So that's the shame of it, really, that it was an amazing opportunity squandered.
Artistically, and especially when we talk about education, there is a prevailing and entrenched tendency towards specialization, with all the forms of pressure exerted on young people. You're either a painter, a filmmaker, a photographer, a writer, and there seems to be a resentment against creative freedom sometimes, with commonplaces like jack of all trades, etc. You are a living antithesis of these supposed laws so many try to impose on young artists. What do you think about this, and what would you say to a young artist that feels somehow in a box?
Well, unsurprisingly, I think it's completely wrong. I don't think it's of any use to compartmentalize people into little boxes, especially in their education. And I think this is a fault in the education system. I think there's a tendency more than ever to make it results-based, which means box ticking, which means pushing people through processes that is basically just parroting facts to get you through an exam to tick a box. And that's nothing to do with education, absolutely nothing to do with education. More now than ever, I mean, at a time when you can ask an AI unit in your home a question and it can come back with the answer. That's just information. We should be teaching, if anything, how to deal with information, how to make sense of it, how to think critically of it. I think our education system needs to be much more based on raw skills to deal with information in our lives, and the ability to stay able to change. We've got a generation of kids going through school now who, when they enter the education system at 5, have absolutely no idea what possible jobs there could be for them when they leave further education in 20 years' time. So you've got to give people the raw skills to be able to change and adapt, and think on their feet, and move around and stay supple, which is the opposite of sticking them in a box and saying you can only do this one thing. It just seems to be criminally letting down our students and young people at the moment. I think the education system was always wrong. I think subjects should have been taught as a project base. So you pick a subject and then you look at that subject from a scientific point of view, and a historical point of view, and an artistic point of view, and a language point of view, and a geographical point of view, and a theological point of view. And that way you get a network of information that all connects, and it has a context, you remember it. Instead of all of these little subjects all teaching odd little things, all off on their own, no connection to each other. It makes absolutely no sense to me. And so I think now more than ever, the education system just needs to be changed from the ground up. And in art schools, they're as bad as any. It's amazing to me, every time I go to teach at an art school or do a lecture, I'm surrounded by one class of people. They just illustration students or just design students. Often in a campus, in a university campus, where over there are scientists, and over there are historians, and over there are, geologists. They all need to talk to each other, and they all need each other. Scientists need artists, because artists think out of the box and think imaginatively. And that's the root, that's the first step in science. And art needs scientists. Art needs to be rooted in the real world, the facts of the real world. And science is the only language that can actually describe what the real world is. They need each other. They should be talking to each other.